It wasn't meant to be emotional. Not like this. As Charles III stepped forward to deliver what aides had described as a routine clarification, something shifted. His voice faltered. And beside him, Camilla, usually composed, unshaken, was visibly in tears. The palace tried to frame it as procedural, but those watching closely knew this was something far deeper, something final. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began with a silence that felt too deliberate to ignore. There had been no long build-up, no carefully staged anticipation, just a sudden announcement placed onto the royal calendar with almost surgical precision. Reports suggest that even senior aides were given limited notice, a move that insiders whisper is highly unusual for any matter involving royal titles. And yet, here it was, a moment that was supposed to pass quietly, reduced to a formal clarification. But nothing about it felt routine. Not the timing, not the tone, and certainly not the emotion that followed. As Charles spoke, there was a weight behind his words that could not be disguised by protocol. Those familiar with his public addresses have long noted his careful, almost measured delivery. But this time, there was hesitation, a pause that lingered just long enough to unsettle. Various interpretations of that moment suggest it was not uncertainty, but conflict. A man caught between duty and something far more personal, because standing beside him was Camilla, a figure who has spent years mastering composure, now unable to hide the visible strain of what was unfolding. Insiders claim the announcement itself was deliberately framed in neutral language phrases like clarification and continuity, carefully chosen to soften what was, in reality, a far more significant shift. But the palace's attempt to control the narrative began to fracture almost immediately. Media outlets, initially unsure how to interpret the statement, started to pick apart every word, every pause, every glance. And as they did, a different story began to emerge, one that suggested this was not simply about a title, but about its meaning and its limits. What made the moment even more striking was the reaction it provoked behind the scenes. Palace administrative streams, ranging from communications staff to long-standing courtiers, reportedly moved quickly to contain the ripple effect. Questions were deflected, clarifications were delayed, and yet, the more the palace tried to steady the situation, the more unstable it appeared. Because the public was no longer just listening to what was being said, they were watching what could not be hidden. The emotion, the tension, the unmistakable sense that something had shifted in a way that could not easily be reversed. And perhaps most telling of all was the way Camilla's reaction lingered long after the words themselves had faded. For years, she has stood at the center of one of the most complex transformations in modern royal history, navigating scrutiny, criticism, and gradual acceptance. But in this moment, that carefully built image seemed to crack, revealing something far more vulnerable beneath. Something that suggested this was not just a public adjustment but a deeply personal reckoning. But what seemed like a simple announcement quickly unraveled into something far more complex, rooted in history, legacy, and a title that was never truly secure. Long before the tears, long before the announcement, there was always a question hanging over Camilla's place within the monarchy. A question that refused to disappear, no matter how carefully it was managed. Because her journey was never meant to be simple. It was never meant to be universally accepted. From the very beginning, when her relationship with Charles III moved from whispered conversations into undeniable reality, the foundation beneath her future role was already unstable. Reports suggest that even as the palace worked tirelessly to reshape public perception, there remained a quiet understanding within royal circles that acceptance could be guided but never fully controlled. And that difference would define everything that followed. For years, the shadow of Diana lingered over every step Camilla took. It was not always spoken aloud, but it was always present. In the public memory, Diana was not just a former royal figure, she was something far more powerful, a symbol of emotion, of loss, of unfinished narrative. And in contrast, Camilla's presence was often interpreted through that lens, whether fairly or not. Insiders whisper that this comparison created a silent barrier, one that no title alone could dismantle. Because while titles can be granted, acceptance must be earned, and even then, it can remain fragile. Yet over time, something did shift. The resistance did not disappear, but it softened. Appearances were carefully managed. Engagements were executed with precision. The language surrounding Camilla evolved, moving from controversy to cautious acknowledgement. Various interpretations suggest this was not accidental, but part of a long-term strategy designed to stabilize her position within the institution. And at the center of that shift was the quiet but powerful influence of Elizabeth II. Because when Elizabeth II made her position known, when she expressed her wish for Camilla to be recognized in a formal and elevated role, it changed the conversation almost overnight. Those familiar with the inner workings of the monarchy understand the weight of such a gesture. It was more than endorsement, it was protection, a signal to both the public and the institution that this path had been sanctioned at the highest level. And yet, even that moment, as decisive as it seemed, did not fully erase the underlying tension. Because beneath the surface, the question remained: was this acceptance permanent or conditional? Palace administrative streams, ranging from historical precedent to modern interpretation, have long debated the nature of such titles. Some insiders suggest that while the endorsement provided legitimacy, it did not eliminate the possibility of future reassessment. Others believe it was always intended as a stabilizing measure rather than a final resolution. And it is within that uncertainty that the real story begins to take shape. Because the monarchy does not operate on emotion alone, it operates on legacy, on continuity, on decisions that often unfold over years rather than moments. And in that context, Camilla's position was never just about the present. It was about how the future would interpret the past, about whether a role built on gradual acceptance could withstand the pressures of time, expectation, and shifting priorities. And so, even as the world began to believe that the matter had been settled, that the long journey had reached its conclusion, there were those within the institution who understood that the story was not over, that what appeared stable on the surface could still be quietly re-evaluated beneath it. That acceptance, once negotiated, could one day be revisited. And while the world believed the matter had been settled, insiders suggest the real decision had only been delayed, waiting for the right moment. Behind the palace doors, the silence wasn't calm, it was calculated. Because what the public didn't see was the growing pressure surrounding Camilla's role, and the quiet resistance building within the institution itself. It was not the kind of resistance that makes headlines. It did not arrive in dramatic statements or public disagreements. Instead, it moved slowly, deliberately, through private conversations and carefully measured pauses. Reports suggest that within the highest levels of the monarchy, there were ongoing discussions, subtle, controlled, but persistent, about the long-term implications of Camilla's position. Not necessarily about her personally, but about what her title represented in a system built on continuity and public trust. And in those conversations, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. At the center of that growing tension was the influence of figures who rarely speak openly, but whose presence carries undeniable weight. Among them, William, Prince of Wales, emerged as a quiet but significant force. Insiders whisper that his perspective was not rooted in conflict, but in caution, a forward-looking approach shaped by the understanding that the monarchy must evolve carefully without losing the fragile balance that sustains it. Because for William, this was never just about the present moment, it was about the future he would eventually inherit and the expectations that would come with it. That perspective, however, did not exist in isolation. It intersected with a broader concern that has long defined the institution: legacy. The monarchy does not simply respond to public opinion, it anticipates it. And as scrutiny around Camilla's role continued to surface in media commentary and insider analysis, the question became harder to ignore. How would this chapter be remembered? Would it strengthen the institution, or quietly complicate its narrative? Various interpretations of internal discussions suggest that these questions were not hypothetical, they were central to the decisions being considered behind closed doors. At the same time, the pressure was not only internal. The external environment was shifting in ways that made every decision more visible, more dissected, more consequential. Media outlets began to revisit old debates, reframing them through a modern lens. Analysts spoke of perception, of symbolism, of the delicate line between tradition and adaptation, and with each new wave of attention, the stakes seemed to rise. Because in the monarchy, Perception is not a secondary concern, it is part of the structure itself. Caught within all of this was Charles III, a figure who, by position, embodies both authority and responsibility, but who by circumstance found himself navigating a deeply personal dilemma. Insiders claim that his position was one of quiet conflict, balancing loyalty to Camilla with an awareness of the broader expectations placed upon the crown. It was not a choice that could be made quickly, nor one that could satisfy every side. And that tension, once contained, began to build. Because the monarchy, for all its tradition, is not immune to pressure. It absorbs it, reshapes it, and eventually responds to it. And as the discussions continued, as the scrutiny intensified, as the balance between personal loyalty and institutional duty became harder to maintain, something began to shift. Not publicly, not yet, but beneath the surface, where the most important decisions are often made. But pressure alone doesn't lead to public announcements. Something must have triggered the moment Charles finally spoke. The decision wasn't sudden. It was the result of weeks, perhaps months of quiet deliberation. And when it finally came, it carried consequences no one inside the palace could ignore. Because by the time Charles III spoke, the outcome had already been shaped behind closed doors, refined through conversations that were never meant to be public. Reports suggest that what appeared as a simple clarification was, in reality, a carefully constructed shift, one that required precision in language and absolute control in delivery. Every word mattered. Every pause carried weight. And those familiar with royal protocol understood immediately that this was not just an adjustment, it was a recalibration. The phrasing itself became the first signal. Insiders whisper that the language used was intentionally restrained, almost understated, designed to soften what could otherwise have felt abrupt. Terms like clarification and continuity were not chosen by accident. They were strategic, crafted to maintain stability while quietly introducing change. But beneath that measured tone, there was something unmistakable, a subtle redirection of meaning, one that suggested the title long associated with Camilla was not as fixed as many had believed. And within the palace, that realization did not go unnoticed. Various interpretations from those close to the situation describe the decision as necessary, a word that carries its own quiet intensity. Necessary not because of a single event, but because of an accumulation of pressures, internal, external, and deeply institutional. It was, according to some accounts, a moment where the monarchy chose to prioritize its long-term structure over short-term comfort, a decision rooted not in emotion, but in preservation. Yet for Camilla, the impact was anything but abstract. For years, her role had been built carefully, layer by layer, through resilience, adaptation, and an unspoken understanding of the challenges she faced. And now, in a single moment, that foundation seemed to shift. Insiders claim that her reaction, visible, unguarded, was not simply about the announcement itself, but about what it represented. A realization that despite everything, despite the years of effort and gradual acceptance, the position she held could still be redefined. That contrast between the controlled delivery of the announcement and the emotional response it triggered only deepened the sense that something significant had taken place. Because in the monarchy, true change rarely arrives with dramatic declarations. It arrives quietly, wrapped in careful language, revealed only to those willing to look beyond the surface. And this was one of those moments. Outside the palace, the reaction began to build almost immediately. Media outlets dissected every detail, from the wording of the statement to the tone in which it was delivered. Analysts debated its meaning, questioning whether this was an isolated adjustment or part of something larger, because the more the announcement was examined, the clearer it became that it could not exist in isolation. It pointed toward a broader shift, one that extended beyond a single title and into the future direction of the monarchy itself. And within that growing wave of interpretation, one idea began to take hold, that this was not the end of a story, but the beginning of a new phase. A phase where decisions would be made more carefully, where roles would be defined more precisely, where the balance between tradition and adaptation would be tested once again. Because if this moment proved anything, it was that even the most established positions within the monarchy are not immune to change. And as the words settled, The real question began to surface, not what was said, but why now? Timing in the royal family is never accidental. And this announcement arrived at a time when everything else seemed uncertain, because behind the carefully controlled tone of the statement, there was a broader context that could not be ignored. Charles III was no longer operating under ordinary circumstances. Reports suggest that his ongoing health challenges had begun to reshape not only his schedule, but the rhythm of decision-making within the monarchy itself. What once might have been delayed, debated, or quietly set aside was now being confronted with a new urgency. And in that urgency, priorities began to shift. Insiders whisper that this shift was not limited to Charles alone. It extended outward, subtly but unmistakably, toward William, Prince of Wales. His presence, already significant, was becoming more defined, more central to the institution's forward movement. Appearances, responsibilities, and influence all began to align in a way that suggested preparation rather than coincidence. Because in the monarchy, visibility is rarely accidental. It is often a signal, a quiet indication of where authority is gradually moving. At the same time, the institution itself was facing a familiar but increasingly pressing challenge: the need to evolve without losing its identity. The pressure to modernize had been building for years, but now it carried a different weight. Analysts and observers began to question whether the monarchy could continue to rely on traditional structures alone, or whether adjustments carefully measured but undeniably real would be necessary to maintain public trust. And within that conversation, every role, every title, every symbol came under renewed scrutiny. This is where the timing of the announcement began to feel less like coincidence and more like strategy. Various interpretations suggest that the decision to address Camilla's title at this particular moment was not isolated, but connected to a larger framework of succession planning. Not immediate succession, but long-term positioning. A way of ensuring that when the transition eventually comes, it does so with clarity rather than confusion. Because uncertainty, once allowed to linger, can weaken even the most established institutions. And yet, for all the strategic explanations, there remained an undercurrent of speculation that refused to settle. Palace administrative streams, along with external commentators, began to question whether this was part of a broader recalibration, one that extended beyond a single announcement. Was this the beginning of a more defined restructuring? A signal that the monarchy was quietly preparing for a different kind of future? Or was it simply a necessary adjustment made under pressure, given greater significance by the moment in which it occurred? Those questions did not have immediate answers, and perhaps they were never meant to. Because within the monarchy, clarity is often revealed slowly, through patterns rather than declarations. What matters is not just what is said, but when it is said, and what surrounds it. And in this case, everything surrounding the announcement pointed toward a moment of transition. Not a dramatic shift, but a subtle realignment, a recognition that the balance between past and future was changing, and that decisions once considered stable could no longer remain untouched. It was a moment shaped by circumstance, by necessity, and by the quiet understanding that the institution must always move forward even when doing so comes at a cost. But while the timing raised questions, the emotional reaction revealed something even deeper, something personal. For a woman known for her resilience, the tears said everything words could not. Because this wasn't just about a title, it was about a lifetime of waiting, fighting, and finally, facing the reality of it all. Because long before the moment that captured global attention, Camilla had already endured a journey that few within the monarchy have ever experienced in quite the same way. It was not a path defined by immediate acceptance or effortless transition. Instead, it was marked by years of quiet endurance, of navigating a space where every gesture was examined, every decision interpreted, and every step forward met with a shadow of doubt. Reports suggest that even as her position became more formalized, the weight of public scrutiny never truly faded, it simply evolved, shifting from open criticism to a more subtle, but equally persistent, form of observation. That scrutiny was not just external. Insiders whisper that over time, it began to shape something internal as well, a constant awareness that her role was not just being lived, but evaluated, that her presence within the monarchy was part of an ongoing conversation rather than a settled conclusion. And in that environment, Resilience was not optional, it was essential, because every appearance, every responsibility carried the unspoken expectation that she would continue to prove her place, again and again, in ways that others were never required to. Yet behind that resilience were sacrifices that rarely entered the public narrative. Personal adjustments, private compromises, a gradual reshaping of identity to align with an institution that demands both visibility and restraint. Various interpretations suggest that over the years, Camilla's role became more than a position, it became a test of endurance. A balance between who she had been and who she needed to become in order to fulfill the expectations placed upon her. And within that transformation, the title she eventually held was not just symbolic, it was deeply personal. Because for Camilla, that title represented more than recognition. It represented validation. A confirmation that the years of uncertainty, of careful navigation, had led to something stable, something secure, something that could finally be held without question. And yet, in that moment of announcement, that sense of certainty appeared to shift. Not dramatically, not in a way that could be easily defined, but enough to create a fracture in what had once felt solid. Insiders claim that her emotional response was not simply about the present decision, but about what it implied. A realization that even after everything, even after the long path toward acceptance, the position she held could still be subject to change. That the stability she had worked toward was, in some ways, more fragile than it seemed. And that realization, once felt, cannot easily be set aside. What made the moment so powerful was the contrast it revealed. The public image of composure and control meeting a private sense of vulnerability that could no longer be concealed. Because in that brief, unguarded reaction, the story of her journey became visible in a way that no official statement could ever fully capture. It was not just about loss, it was about recognition of how much had been given, and how much could still be redefined. And perhaps that is what made the moment resonate so deeply. Not because it changed everything in an instant, but because it exposed something that had always existed beneath the surface. A quiet tension between achievement and uncertainty, between acceptance and the possibility of reconsideration, between the role that was lived and the reality that could still evolve. And yet, beyond the emotion and the headlines, the monarchy itself was quietly shifting into something new. While attention remained fixed on Camilla, the institution moved forward quietly, deliberately reshaping itself for a future that may look very different from its past. Because in the monarchy, stillness is often an illusion. Even in moments dominated by emotion and speculation, the structure beneath continues to adjust, to realign, to prepare. And insiders suggest that while public focus remained locked on the immediate impact of the announcement, a far more strategic evolution was already underway. One that had less to do with reaction and more to do with direction. At the center of that shift stood William, Prince of Wales, and Catherine, Princess of Wales. Their roles, already significant, began to take on a new clarity, not through dramatic declarations, but through a steady increase in visibility, responsibility, and symbolic presence. Reports suggest that this was not simply a continuation of their existing duties, but a deliberate strengthening of their position within the institution. A quiet signal that the future was no longer something distant, it was something being actively shaped in the present. This shift was closely tied to a broader priority that has become increasingly central to the monarchy: long-term public trust. Because beyond titles and traditions, the institution relies on something far more fragile: perception, and maintaining that perception requires careful calibration, especially during periods of uncertainty. Various interpretations suggest that recent decisions, including the one surrounding Camilla, were influenced by a growing awareness that the monarchy must not only endure, but adapt in ways that resonate with a changing public. That adaptation, however, is never straightforward. It involves redefining expectations without abandoning identity. It requires balancing continuity with progress, tradition with relevance. And within that balance, certain adjustments become necessary. Insiders whisper that part of this process involves a subtle distancing from past controversies, not through denial, but through reorientation. A shift in focus toward figures and narratives that align more closely with the image the monarchy seeks to project moving forward. This is where the consolidation of influence becomes critical, because as the institution evolves, it must also ensure that authority remains clear, cohesive, and effective. Reports suggest that recent developments have contributed to a more defined structure, one where roles are not only clarified but reinforced, where the direction of the monarchy is guided by a smaller, more focused group, capable of navigating both internal challenges and external expectations with greater precision. And within that consolidation lies the clearest signal of all, the beginning of a new era. Not one marked by sudden transformation, but by gradual, deliberate change. A transition that respects the past while quietly preparing for what comes next. Because in the monarchy, the most significant shifts are rarely announced. They are revealed over time, through patterns that only become visible in hindsight. What makes this moment particularly significant is the way these changes are unfolding alongside emotional and symbolic events. Because while the public narrative may center on individual experiences, the institutional narrative is moving in parallel, shaping outcomes that extend far beyond any single figure. And it is within that parallel movement that the true direction of the monarchy can be understood. Because even as one chapter appears to close, or at least to shift, another is already taking form, one defined by new priorities, new expectations, and a renewed focus on stability and continuity. And while the details may remain subtle, the trajectory is becoming increasingly clear. But every shift comes with consequences, and not all of them are visible right away. In the end, royal titles are never just titles. They are symbols of power, of acceptance, of history, and sometimes they are reminders of battles quietly fought and quietly lost. Because what unfolded around Camilla was never confined to a single announcement or a single moment of emotion. It was the culmination of a journey that had always existed under scrutiny, shaped not only by personal choices but by the weight of an institution that rarely bends without leaving a mark. Her legacy, now being quietly defined in real time, carries both the strength of endurance and the shadow of uncertainty. Reports suggest that while she secured a place within the monarchy that once seemed out of reach, the nature of that place has always been more complex than it appeared on the surface. Public perception, as it has throughout her journey, remains divided but no longer in the same way. The sharp resistance of the past has softened into something more reflective, more measured. And yet, even in that shift, there is an undercurrent of ambiguity. Because the recent announcement did not just revisit her role, it reframed it. It introduced a new layer to a narrative that many believed had already reached its conclusion. And in doing so, it reminded the public that within the monarchy, acceptance is not always final. It can evolve, adapt, and sometimes retreat. At the heart of this moment lies a tension that has defined not just Camilla's story, but the monarchy itself, the balance between duty and personal desire. For years, her role has required a careful alignment between who she is and what the institution demands. Insiders whisper that this alignment is never static. It shifts with circumstance, with expectation, with the unspoken rules that govern royal life. And in this case, that balance appears to have reached a point where adjustment became inevitable. Not dramatic, not explosive, but undeniable. For Charles III, the role in shaping this outcome cannot be separated from the broader responsibilities he carries. His decision, delivered with measured restraint, reflects not just personal consideration but institutional necessity. Various interpretations suggest that what he faced was not a choice between right and wrong, but between competing obligations, loyalty to Camilla and duty to the crown. And in the end, it was the latter that guided the final outcome, reinforcing a principle that has long defined the monarchy. The institution must endure, even when it demands difficult decisions. And yet, beyond the individuals involved, there is something larger at play: the enduring influence of royal tradition, a system built on continuity, on precedent, on the careful preservation of identity across generations. It is this tradition that shapes decisions, often in ways that are not immediately visible. It is this tradition that ensures the monarchy remains recognizable even as it adapts. And it is this tradition that ultimately frames how moments like this are understood not just in the present, but in the years to come. Because history does not judge in real time. It observes, it gathers, it reflects. and the question of how this moment will be remembered remains open. Will it be seen as a necessary adjustment in a changing institution, or as a moment where personal sacrifice met institutional reality in a way that could not be avoided? The answer, as always, will depend on how the story continues to unfold. What is certain, however, is that this was never just about a title. It was about what that title represented, what it carried, and what it revealed when placed under pressure. It was about the intersection of personal journey and institutional demand, of acceptance earned and acceptance reconsidered. And in that intersection, the true complexity of the monarchy becomes clear. Because in the House of Windsor, nothing truly ends, it simply becomes part of the story that continues to unfold. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.